All right, so welcome everyone. Thanks so much for joining us. We are going to be, Patrick, I'll just stop screen sharing, turn it back over to you once we cross the threshold. So intros in a sec here, but what we're going to be discussing today, we're going to leave a lot of time for Q&A, but we're going to be discussing today some of the ways that conventional approaches to API and end-to-end testing provide a false sense of security that that then leaves ongoing risk that engineering leaders have to deal with, and of course, what our approaches are to, what Prod Perfect's and API Fortress's approaches are to trying to resolve that, resolve the risks that lead to that false sense of security. I'll be spending a little bit of time. Patrick will be spending a little time, and we'll be coming back together to talk about kind of what the implications are of making a change. I'll start by introducing myself. I'm Eric. I'm one of the founders at Prod Perfect. I'm the Chief Revenue Officer, and I actually come from like a heavy-leaded industrial operations background, and ended up meandering my way back into software engineering after actually like failing my intro to software engineering classes back in college. Kind of figured it out in the school for hard knocks, and fell in love with quality assurance, working on the front lines of factories, and ended up bringing that approach to thinking about QA and software. That's been a lot of fun, and Prod Perfect's been around for 2.5 years now. You can see on Crunchbase sort of what our fundraising has looked like, but it's been a ton of fun. We've had a lot of great. I think we've actually got a couple of our customers on the call. We've had a lot of great opportunities to work with a lot of great people, and I'm grateful for everyone that we've got the opportunity to share some stuff with you today. Patrick.
Introducing myself, right?
Yes. Yeah, go for it.
Patrick, CEO of API Fortress. Been in the API space now for like 10 years, specific to API Fortress for 5. Background is in mobile and retail, so both are pretty API heavy, especially with like mobile apps and stuff. So that's me.
Yeah, so what Patrick and I are both going to be talking about is a tendency that's been true in software engineering quality assurance for a long time, that's been based on the limitations of the technology that's been available to quality assurance and software leaders for decades. Right, so we're going to be talking about a mode of operation that has been constrained by the tool sets that have been available. I'm going to start by talking about the end-to-end space, where functionally when we think about what our test scenarios should be, we end up actually doing a lot of ultimately brainstorming in looking at our entire application and deciding what's in and what's out of our end-to-end testing suite. We end up, sort of like marking stuff as priority 1, priority 2, and using those markings based on the requirements that we see to develop end-to-end test scripts, right? So if you think of the typical cycle here, we look at our requirements, we make a choice here of what are going to be our test cases, develop those into scripts, maintain those, the scripts themselves, and then try to update the end-to-end test suite as our application changes. And there's a lot of tool sets that exist to try to make this step easier, right? This end-to-end script development and maintenance easier. And I think the thing that's been missing from the industry for a very long time is that nobody goes back to this requirement step and thinks, how do we better help quality assurance leaders decide what to test? How do we make sure that the right tests are getting into the end-to-end test suite? And because there's not a lot of data that goes into this decision-making, a trend that happened throughout the industry, started some 20 years ago, was that we decided that more tests were better, right? So if we get a bunch of QA leaders in the room, we talk about how their test suites are looking, typically they'll talk about how many end-to-end tests are there, right? And someone's like, well, I have 20 end-to-end tests, and someone has 1,000, and everyone goes, wow, that's really impressive. That's a lot of end-to-end tests. You've clearly put a lot of effort into this, which is true. But the question is whether that larger test suite necessarily provides more quality assurance value to the software team than a smaller one. And one way that we can kind of as a thought experiment, decisively understand that the conventional approach of look at requirements and decide what to test doesn't yield an objectively good result is that if you had two smart, capable quality assurance teams, both look at the same application, the same set of requirements, they would come up with different testing priorities, right? They would come up with different priority 1, priority 2, priority 3 test sets. And that's because prioritization is difficult. The way that we fundamentally prioritize, you go back to this brainstorming point, is based on either some experience with the application, experience with other applications, or something else that's informed a sort of art or craft approach to this, right? So we depend on quality assurance engineers and leaders to be experienced so that their craft in deciding what end-to-end test scenarios that we're going to run is effective. But we still have a large amount of subjectivity here in deciding what to test. And that's ultimately where our false sense of security comes in end-to-end testing, that we could produce a large number of tests. This would give us some sense of security, but there are a few things missing from this, right? And they can really hurt us. One of them is that we may have just missed some high priority areas, right? Again, because we're applying subjectivity to this, we may be missing certain tests that should be in there. So we're gonna miss bugs, right? And the larger your end-to-end test suite is, the less likely that is, because you just throw so much at the wall that there's a decent chance you are testing what's most important to your users. But as your end-to-end test suite gets bigger, you introduce newer risks. One of them is that you have many low-value tests, you don't know it. This has a very high maintenance cost associated with it. Everyone knows how flaky these big test suites get, and therefore how much of your resource you're going to be putting into maintaining these tests that don't necessarily provide value. This takes away from your ability to provide a better, or to develop a better product and bring it to market faster, which introduces, of course, business risk to your competitors who are potentially using their resources more effectively. And then the final risk that we see is high runtime in these test suites. So large test suites take a very long time to run. We've seen test suites that take, many take hours, some take days. So they can only be run infrequently. These end-to-end test suites, make it run at the end of every 2-week sprint. This lower frequency of running end-to-end tests ultimately means that, and a lot of us have experience with this, you know exactly what I'm talking about, that we have, our 1,000 tests run at the end of 2 weeks, 200 of the tests break, and we have to spend all this time thinking about, which of these are actually bugs, who wrote the bug, do we need to fix it before it goes to prod, and do we, and how do we assign that work? Are we going to delay our product even further? And so we introduce greater risk by having fewer test suite runs due to this large end-to-end test suite. So the way out of it is ultimately to prioritize. And what we ultimately want to do is prioritize with data, which is what we'll be talking about in a minute. You guys are all familiar, I'm sure, with the Google testing pyramid, which we've always believed in, that you should have a small number of end-to-end tests, much larger number of lower level tests. They're cheaper, they run faster, they provide greater precision. End-to-end tests, however, are special. Right? There should be a small number of them that are highly focused on what our users most care about. And the way that the technology in the QA space has failed leaders in the past is that nobody has provided this data to QA leaders to decide, of the small number of tests that can fit in the top of this pyramid so that it can run quickly, be maintained cheaply, and also cover what matters most to our users. Of that small number of tests, which ones should be in and which ones should be out, right? So how do we actually bring data to this in order to get us out of this false sense of security problem? Well, the good news is the data that we need to make these decisions already exists, right? And our users are telling us exactly what matters to them. And that's the philosophy that we subscribe to at ProdPerfect, that the things that you should be testing, the things that really matter in your application, the ones that should have end-to-end tests, are the workflows that your users actually perform, right? And so luckily, they're throwing all sorts of product analytics data at us as engineering leaders all the time. And we just need to use that in order to tell us what do our users really care about. Let's make sure those workflows work. Let's make sure that end-to-end, we've got those covered. Because ultimately, if you look at your application, often they can get quite broad, but every application's usage patterns, if you look at different workflows that people go through, has a head and a long tail, right? So in this hypothetical graph, The y-axis is frequency. The x-axis is a stack ranking of different workflows, different patterns of behavior that people are going through. And we should be testing the ones that are up here, and we should not be investing in end-to-end tests for the ones that are down here, right? And we can use product analytics data to do that. The way that Prod Perfect happens to approach it is we collect clickstream metadata from our customers, and our engine analyzes it to highlight those patterns, to understand what are those key test cases that we should be covering based on how users are using the application. We then actually finish the test script ourselves. We add mock data and stabilize the tests, and we deploy end-to-end test code to our customers so that we're building for them this end-to-end test suite and maintaining it for them. I'm not going to go into a demo, but the short version is the analysis engine uses a bunch of, obviously, algorithms to look at what are the interaction points that people are going through and how are they traversing between them? What are these like most trodden paths that we're seeing on the application, login, checkout, all that good stuff. And it tells us decisively, hey, these are the things that your users are doing frequently, that's green. And here are the things that they're barely touching, that's red. Let's not test those, right? And that's how we are able to use facts to answer this question of what should and should not be in this test suite. What we're able to do over time is for our customers is maintain this by continually reanalyzing that data and understanding how are these priorities for users changing as features are modified, as new features are added, et cetera, in order to make sure that the test suite keeps up with the application and evolves without becoming bloated and just growing, over time into that 4-day, millions of dollars a year to maintain kind of test suite that we've all had nightmares about. Ultimately, whether you use Prod Perfect or not, this data-driven approach, I think, is the technology, the machine learning technology space has like finally matured to a point that it's entered, that's entered the end-to-end QA space well enough to be able to support this kind of motion, and it allows us to have a paradigm shift that was impossible before about what we can do to better prioritize what we test and what we choose to cover and not. So, Mr. Poulin.
All right, can you hear me?
Yes, we can.
Great. So let me do this, then I do that. Can you guys see my screen?
Yes.
Yes.
All right.
If you want to go into, present mode.
I think it is in present mode. It's working, right?
Okay, I'm seeing, you're probably going to want to share a different screen. I'm seeing your notes.
Oh my goodness.
I mean, notes are fine, but.
Yeah, I mean, they're not that interesting. Share screen. Oh, I know what I did. I want to do this. Is that working correctly?
Much better.
There it is. All right, internet. I'll figure it out at some point. Cool. Yes. So I'm Patrick, CEO of API Fortress. And so what we focus on specifically is automated testing of APIs, but it's actually sort of evolved in an interesting way over the last few years, because with that automation runs on every build, but people are building so much, it's sort of getting into the monitoring space. So that's the part that I'm finding really interesting. And that's the part I want to talk about, because it's when people start talking about monitoring, they're sort of thinking they have coverage that they don't have. So more specifically, like, what's a good API monitor at the end of the day? So what's been interesting is a lot of people we talk to, they have application monitors, say APMs they call them, like the New Relics, the Datadogs, and they think they're getting API coverage using them. But the reality is what those are offering are up and downs. And up and down isn't enough when it comes to something as nuanced as an API. And we know that just because, generally speaking, like the internet runs off APIs, number one, but number two, all of these vulnerabilities and these hacks that we've seen that are specific to APIs aren't actually like hacks. They use the word and they want to say hackers, but the reality is it's human error gone live. These are functional issues gone live, and it's a complete lack of functional monitoring. And that's sort of the buzzword that I'm trying to invent. I'm gonna make it stick at some point, but that's sort of the buzzword of like, don't just monitor up or down, but like run your functional tests as your monitors. So like the analogy I sort of like to go into is when you look at an API, like what is an API? an API is just, it's a bunch of data. I sort of look at it as a book. There's a lot of stuff in there, and you have to like validate not just the top of it, but every single object and all the data associated with it. So the analogy I like to make is more just imagine you have a child in school. How do you prove that they're doing well in school? Like, do you just use their attendance numbers, or do you do standardized testing? So to me, monitoring should be a standardized test of your API. It's like validate that the knowledge coming out of it is actually what's anticipated. So to go into a little more detail of that, an API like functional test should be used as a monitor, and that should be what you're using as your SLAs. It sort of sounds crazy to some people, but that's what it should be. Like, so when you look at the API monitors out there today, like so one of the biggest issues we see today is that when people see like an API, they have this assumption that it's either up or down. And so having the assumption of up or down leads to people not recognizing that there's an issue in the API. And these uncaught errors can go on for months and lead to like catastrophic results. So for example, on our blog, we talk about 3 of them, like Twitter, India, and the United States Postal Service. All 3 of them had significant issues related to their APIs that led to the release of 17 million, 1 billion, and 60 million like personal account details. And none of them were using a hack. It was literally just a functional issue or a security or a permission issue. So like some of these private APIs were put public, and some of the other ones were just allowing you just to search by wildcard. I mean, the United States Postal Service, that's literally the issue that happened to them. It was nothing drastic. They had a search, and if you had a specific number, you would get your details. But if you just use the wildcard in the API call, you got everyone's details. And testing to make sure you don't get too much information it's a negative test. It's a negative functional test. It's sort of built into what the expectations should be relative to what you should be testing. So if we take a step back, like what is actually causing this problem that we're seeing today? And it's actually a little more interesting. It's a little more political in a way. It has a lot to do with, especially with larger companies, with who owns monitoring. So when you actually look at monitoring, when you think about it, when people think of monitoring, they look at these platforms, New Relic, AppDynamics, BlazeMeter, Datadog, like Dynatrace. They're looking at these things as monitors. But if you actually individually go into each of them with the mindset of, well, how can they do functional uptime monitoring of APIs? What you're actually seeing is some significant weaknesses. So the first one is, and this is a funny little buzzword, a little industry fun for you guys, is if you see the word synthetic, that means minimal. That means almost none. It's almost like the word, on food and beverage when they use the word light, but it's L-I-T-E. Well, if they use L-I-G-H-T, it's illegal, but L-I-T-E is not a real word, so it's not illegal for you to mark a food item as light, even if it isn't light. So like that's what they're doing with synthetic testing. They're not saying we do functional API testing. They're just saying synthetic because it's mostly up or down, maybe a status code 200. It's not really giving you what you need to do. And what you need to do is go through an entire API consumer flow. So let's say it's like an e-commerce API. So search, add to cart, checkout. That should be one test, one end-to-end integration test. That's what you should be using for your monitors. The other issue is when we talk about monitoring at a company, person in charge of monitoring is not a testing expert usually. So it's a completely different department with a different mindset, and they probably don't even understand the actual business intentions of the API, which is a significant item when it comes to wanting to validate the API is doing what it should be doing. The other item is, again, if they're using one of the previous platforms I mentioned, they're not using your existing functional tests. So we have to do all this functional testing as part of releases, and then someone else is doing load testing, and then someone else is doing the monitoring, when all of that should be put together, all using the same smart tests written by your QA or testing or developers or whoever your professionals are that know what the intention of the API is and what to validate. And again, that just comes into like sort of the last piece, which is how smart is this test? You should be validating everything in an API, including the business logic. So what we mean by business logic is when you do a search from an e-commerce website, we'll go to that again, and you do the search for color red. or red can end up giving you shoes or pants. Well, every single item has a size object, and that object has a range. But pants and shoes are sized very differently from each other. But you should have a test that actually validates each of those. So if it's a pair of shoes, 2 through 12, and if it's a pair of pants, 28 to 38. And then there's dresses and hats, and there's all sorts of different types of sizes, but they should be uniquely tested for based on the item that's returned, because everyone wants to do really smart, data-driven testing. So to sort of summarize the whole thing, what people need to do more is leverage everyone's pushing to automated testing. What they need to do is leverage that more in the monitoring and the load testing. But for this discussion, we'll stick to monitoring. Use those same tests, those same professionals, and that same domain knowledge, and extend it to the monitoring piece any way you can, whether it's building your own platform or leveraging another, like API Fortress or Prod Perfect or whatever. Like, leverage that intelligence to your monitoring so that it's becoming synonymous and the same thing. Because we're doing so many releases now and it's all automated. At the end of the day, it's monitoring. That's what monitoring is. It's just something tested constantly, but make it actually your functional tests that are tested constantly. So that sort of leads into sort of the unique thing that API Fortress is offering these days, is that we actually just released OnDemand. So because our platform can generate API tests for you, and we could generate functional tests, we can actually set that up for you, so we don't need to leverage any of your existing IT resources. But the major parts of that to consider are making sure those APIs are publicly available, because this offering is for our cloud platform. So that's one of the interesting things to always consider when it comes to APIs. It's an iceberg. 10% are available publicly, but 90% are behind a firewall. So when you consider what you want to do for your API process, you want to make sure that you're considering both pieces of that, because how you treat the public and partner APIs versus the internals should be combined in some capacity. So what does this mean in terms of what it gives to you as a company? Ultimately, comes down to just reducing risk. Again, people use the word security very much too often because they see dollar signs when they hear the word security. But the reality is, when we're talking about security, and as I was saying in the earlier slides, security is most of the things we screw up are human error. So just testing, at least for that human error, can eliminate 95% of what's seen in the market today. So just literally making sure you're working with people that know what they're doing, they have the domain knowledge, to make sure that you're not releasing these issues live, because that's when it really hurts you. And it really hurts you because if you don't catch it before it goes live, and you don't catch it live, it just keeps going and living forever until someone all of a sudden gets 60 million personal details out of this API that had this basic human error go live. And then ultimately, the purpose of the on-demand is just the people have limited resources, especially today, and budgets are being tightened. So we released the on-demand specifically to help with companies that are getting tightened IT resources, because we can actually do the setup and the generation of these tests for you. But that's something we could talk about later on. So I think now is the Q&A part, right, Eric?
Absolutely.
Cool. So I guess we'll just give it a minute.
So folks, you should be able to, in the chat in the lower right-hand corner, send us some questions. We'll see them, and we will take them as they come. I should go back on video.
He's back on video.
Yeah, and Allison, can you kind of field questions for us and read them for everyone?
Absolutely. All right, so one question here. This one's for Eric. What metrics can you use besides usage frequency to decide what's important to test?
Ooh, yeah, okay, interesting. This is one we actually get a lot, where I think there's some there's some initial discomfort with bringing data into this, because of course I'll stand on my soapbox for a sec. There's a comfort with doing things the old way, right? And the old way has some flaws, but when we introduce change, right, we've gotten comfortable with the old flaws, and we introduce change, and the new ways, the new way, I'll be the first to admit, is not perfect, and I'll talk about some of the imperfections, and we should be aware of those imperfections as well. But how do we get people comfortable with this idea? To elaborate as well as I can, I think on where the question is coming from is, the way Prod Perfect thinks about coverage, thinks about what tests should be in and what should be out, is we say, okay, are they being, how many people are doing this frequently, right? I mentioned this well-trodden path. And so our questioner might be asking, what about essentially edge cases or less frequent behaviors that we think should be tested? And one answer to this, the easy one for me is that, well, you've got to at some point accept that there's going to be a lot that you don't test end to end, right? That's by design, right? And so a lot of the stuff that's being done less often, it just shouldn't be tested. Or most of the workflows that your users are going through less often just shouldn't be tested end to end. We should make sure that there are lower level tests at the unit level, at the API level, integration level, to be able to test the core functionality here. End-to-end tests are a sledgehammer, right? The way I like to think of it is actually a lot like the Mars rover, right? Like you can, test each component of the Mars rover, test the subcomponent of the Mars rover in a lab. You can do it at high frequency, high iteration, but an end-to-end test is putting the entire Mars rover together and driving around in a Mars-like environment. It's expensive. You don't test every part of the Mars rover that way. You just make sure the whole thing works together. So long story short is to some extent you need to let go of the idea of having everything in your end-to-end test suite, because that will fail. And then, but as far as other ways of prioritizing besides just usage frequency, there are a few of the things that we can introduce that actually are more reliant on an outside service like Prod Perfect, such as riskiness, right? And so you could have a machine learning system that's smart enough to understand the code base and assess riskiness of different feature sets, right? Because the feature sets that have a higher likelihood of failing, you want to have some sort of end-to-end test for likely. And then also you can get predictive. So as you release new features, before usage has been on those, something that has, a service or a tool, a machine learning tool set that has experience with other past applications, can predict, are people likely to use this? How is this likely to fit in, and try to fit that. And then I think the third is not just frequency, but kind of bottleneck criticality, right? So if we map people's usage on a map the way that we did earlier, and I'll wrap this question up. And I was going to bring up that map. We can see that certain features are kind of bottlenecks through which other features are accessible, right? So if that feature goes down, you actually lose a whole part of your application. And looking at those bottlenecks as well and promoting those is another way that we can choose to add some layer of, essentially a new metric besides just usage frequency to be able to have the test suite be fully robust. But ultimately, so I think, we can add these other ways of looking at it, and those are the flaws with the current approach, is that, our current approach doesn't include risk prediction or bottlenecking, and it can in time, and ultimately what we're seeing here is this inflection point of the let's use our gut and our experience approach, and that getting over a hump to a fully robust let's use data approach, that'll get there eventually with other metrics of data added in. So those are some of the other ways that we can look at it.
Great. This next question is for Patrick. Why should I run my API tests as a monitoring tool? If the API was thoroughly tested in integration testing and regression, what new things are going to be caught by running the tests every hour or so as a monitoring tool would do as a health check?
Great question. There's a bunch. The easiest example I'll tell you is when you run a test, you use test data. APIs are a direct connection to your data, and your test data, it might just be a spreadsheet of 50 things that always works. But what happens when you actually use your actual like public data, your actual production environment data? So a lot of the issues that are caught through an API are caught because they're actually data issues. So it's not even API specific. So how the API delivers something is an issue you should be catching, but what about what it's actually delivering? So I'll give you one example. We have a customer. Yeah, so we have a customer. They're an e-commerce website. And so what they actually had is an issue whereby every item, so you could upload items to sell them. When you upload an item, you have to choose a category. They had 3,000 items a day, or they had 3,000 items per day that had no category associated. And those categories were directly used by the homepage navigation. So how was it uploaded without a category? Well, there's a completely separate team that was in charge of creating the web page that actually uploads the items, and they forgot to make category a required field, which is just a basic HTML piece of code. They forgot to do that. But when you do a large organizations, I just described 3 entirely different teams all sort of working together and leading to this result of 3,000 items at an average value of $25. It's like $60,000 worth of items potentially not sold, all because someone just didn't require category to be done. But how can you catch that category isn't filled in? That's the sort of thing only an API, like a smart API test, can catch. So it's literally a lot. We talk about data-driven tests, but when I talk about it, I mean like use a lot of production environment data as your test data, even if you have to clone it and mock it or anonymize it in some way. Like that's the issue we catch often. It's not even about the API being up or down. It's it's what's being delivered as much as how it's being delivered.
Great. Here's another one. How do you address the data needs in a dynamic environment? For example, if you're in hospitality, you may have different hotel divisions who are using a very similar code base, but the data is quite different from one division to the next.
Is that a question? Is that an API related question or an end-to-end question? Possibly both.
Yeah, I mean, possibly both. What's interesting with us is that what we suggest to API Fortress when we're talking about creating tests and data-driven tests, we're actually suggesting you use APIs as your data. So you connect the APIs. So for example, we have one book publisher, which we found a large issue with them that had to do with they were caching they were using an API manager and they were caching their product listing endpoint. But the problem is when they refreshed the database, they forgot to purge the cache. So every week they would have their partner API delivering bad ISBNs, product IDs, to their partners for 2 to 3 hours once a week. Like it was catastrophic, but they didn't know that because it was live data. So what we had done, and then the reason why we caught it, and they were doing it for a year before they brought us on board, and then we started catching it. What we suggest is, so you take the product listing endpoint, which lists, let's say, all of your products. It's the same thing we did for that e-commerce company I was talking about. One endpoint gives you a list of all the products. Then you use that list of all of those products and connect it to your next call and dive into randomly 1,000 of them. And you get the product details of each of those individual products. So your test is going through multiple steps. It's saying, give me every product. Let me dive into hundreds of these randomly. Let me validate that next phase, and then we can move on to our next test. So connecting them and using APIs as your source of data for your APIs. And it's some people only have database access, but what's interesting, like we actually have an open source tool called Bloodhound, where you can actually convert your database, if it's some sort of JDBC database, into an API to sort of make that possible if it's not possible today.
And my approach on end-to-end testing is briefer. Is that for testing different data sets, I happen to recommend don't do it in end-to-end testing. So if you have basically push it down to lower levels, and I'll use a very simple example to illustrate how I think about it. So let's say you had two hotel chains that were like regionally very different, right? So they're one of them is in the United States, so it's using US dollars and United like Stripe for payment processing. And then another one's in Europe, it's using euros and pounds and all sorts of other stuff. And it's using different payment processors. I would recommend having, you'd want different end-to-end tests because the code base is now different, right? But then you're also using just this like wildly different, to the, I think, oh, that's a trick question. Yeah, so to Trick's point, using wildly different data, like different kinds of addresses, different, you may even have some, I mean, this example may fall apart because you probably have different form fields and everything, but bear with me. But the data sets being so different, I think, you should be able to push down to lower levels. Here's an example in payment processing, for example, sales tax, right? So I remember talking with a company that wanted us to have 50 different checkout tests for the 50 different states that you could be shipping their products to so that you could make sure sales tax worked for each of them. And I asked them at some point, if what you want to test is the sales tax calculator, why go through all the effort of spinning up, a browser, right? That Mars rover example, or analogy, why go through all the effort of spinning up a browser? Why not just have a sales tax calculator test where you have a bunch of unit tests that are like, I enter a price and I enter a state and I expect, a certain multiple to come out, right? In California, it's like 80% or something, right? So I expect 80% sales tax in California to pop out. And if that doesn't happen, then I'm in trouble. So generally speaking, I think like it is so much more efficient to test data to test handling different forms of data at lower levels. And I think you actually have mutually exclusive functionality that you're testing from that versus what you're getting end to end. Because if you have a failure, I think there is no way to, if you have one end-to-end test for checkout, and then you have your 50 lower level tests for the sales tax calculator, I think it is impossible to miss a bug that would have been like sales tax data related at the end-to-end level that you wouldn't have caught at the lower level due to the overlap you get between the end-to-end and lower level testing. Sorry, that was long.
Great. We have two more. This one's for Patrick. Does API Fortress have a strategy for data governance, i.e. some tests can be run by some teams, also audit compliance, etc.?
Yeah, so the big item with that, and so we actually just deployed yesterday with a large company specific to this. So we have a cloud platform, but also like a lot of our large clients, customers, are using our container, so it's self-hosted. So what they do is they deploy it within their own, using the container within their own environments. So they either lock down the environment, so some teams don't even have access to it, or within our platform, you could actually create user roles in companies. So you can have like different teams within one platform. So one team can't look at the other team, they're separate. But then within one team, there's user roles as well. So some are analysts, some are developers, and some are managers that could do a lot of the notification setups. So there's multiple ways to do it. It's really flexible when it comes to deploying it, self-deploying it though.
Okay, and Patrick, another one for you. When functionally testing production in order to monitor it, how to either prevent introducing bogus test data into production systems, or at least prevent negative impact of test data in production?
Yeah, so that's an interesting one. It actually comes up fairly often when we're actually doing an onboarding. So there's basically three ways to do it. One is you work with their developers so that there's sort of like a secret code. So if I were to use credit card number 411111, they know not to process it, but it processes it as if it actually works. That was a pretty popular one back when I was doing like e-commerce mobile websites, but tricks like that are fairly popular. That's one. The second one is, again, when you use a flexible platform that allows you to do multiple steps, create user, edit user, and at the last step it does is it deletes the original user. So it sort of remembers, like you said, a variable that remembers the product, the user ID, so that at the end of it, it actually deletes it. That one's a little scary. If your test breaks, you might have, and it doesn't notify you, you might start. I actually built a mobile website for Shop NBC, and I accidentally ordered 21 televisions on a Sunday. Like I came in Monday, and the last step of the test was breaking, but it was ordering and not deleting it. So that one's a little scary. And then the third one, I mean, this seems stupid, but some people, the reality is some people are just like, I'm just not going to test create user. They'll test every other endpoint, but they just won't test the one that might keep adding fake data. But again, like the very first one and the smartest one is if you can have sort of a code word with the backend engine, so it knows to process it, but then to purge it out at a later date, and then to not take it overly seriously, like the credit card for one, and it's a 4 and 15 ones, I believe is what it was. Then the other one is again end-to-end testing.
Yeah, we have the same thing. Actually, one of the ways that Prod Perfect gets complicated, we typically as much as possible want to test on, we're all about, testing left early, early feedback on regression, and so we want to test in a dev or staging environment. Sometimes we actually have a monster enterprise customer. Their e-commerce, and they were like, hey, can we test on prod? And we were it was the first time we did it. It was with this huge account. We were scared out of our wits, and it took a lot of time. This was also a team that purposely didn't have a QA team, right? They were going for like the hardcore Silicon Valley, like QA teams are a thing of the past. It's all going to be our devs. Realize their devs, like we're struggling because their devs are not trained QA automation engineers, right? And so they came to us and they said, hey, can we test on prod? We said, we'd rather not, but it's a lot of money, so let's give it a shot. And what we ended up having to do was be very, very clear on what were our safeguards for making sure that the only kind of data that could be, added by we're at this point, we're literally sending bots on the application. So we had to think about like, how do we prevent messing up their product analytics, as well as, buying 21 TVs. And ultimately what we had to do was like have a hardcore shared understanding of exactly what data, formats, syntaxes, and tags that we'd be adding to everything. So like all of our fake users had a tag, it was like, plus fake user XYZ kind of thing, so that they were able to set up, and we had to run, these tests in a virtual machine to make sure that it was ready to go before it went live. There's a lot of testing and prod is always a bear. They love it, but and we do now too, but it definitely requires more forethought for just that reason.
Great. Well, I think that's all the questions, unless anyone has any others that you want to quickly get in the chat. But other than that, we can wrap it up.
So what I'll do is I'll fill some time in case someone else wants to add a question or two. But obviously, one of the great things about working with certain service providers in this space is that our sales motion has to be kind of free consulting as well. So I as much as I'm not in the business of giving free consulting, ultimately, for us to end up working with the customer, we need to be, part of their strategic discussions. Same is true of Patrick's team. So if you end up like having some thoughts that bounce around from this, feel free to reach out. The give and get is you'll get a bunch of free advice. You'll be able to noodle on some stuff with us. The give is that we're going to pitch our product to you and see if it's the right fit for you. But ultimately for everyone on this, I think I see a few folks that are already working with Patrick, or already working with us, which is great to see. But those of you who are new, feel free to reach out. We're going to be following up, obviously, with contact information to get to either Patrick or myself directly, to say hi, ask some questions, we of course look forward to hearing from any and all of you. These are great questions. Always great to be kept on our toes.
Yeah. So I'm Patrick at apifortress.com if you have any questions. Like the reality is there's a lot of free tools out there, and like the Postman and the Ready API, the SoapUI is the free version of it. There's free tools out there, and you can just code your own. So the reality is, if you're just looking for some advice, we're always willing to add advice. The reality is, like, when people bring us in, it's either because they're lacking they don't have enough IT resources, they need a little bit of help setting it up, or they're just looking to really focus on it and empower like a team to do it more efficiently. because the reality is, like, if you're using Postman, you want to create a smart test, you're basically a JavaScript engineer, and not many people are that versed in JavaScript while also being QA professionals at every company. So it's, and also just the reality is, like, using the Postman, especially like data-driven testing and multi-step tests are a complete bear because it's a downloadable application. So it's rough. But again, if anyone just needs some help or some questions answered, Patrick API Fortress, and then Eric.
Ooh, we've got a question. We've got a question for you from Trig again. So does API Fortress have any integrations with some of the leading monitoring tools?
Oh, yeah. So we plug in with Datadog, New Relic, finishing the one with App Dynamics. The one advantage we have versus a lot of the tools out there is that we're actually sort of cloud first or API first. So we're able to integrate because of the API with anything. So in terms of monitoring, a lot of people like to have one unified dashboard for everything. So that's why we have like a Splunk, Elastic integrations, Datadog, New Relic, or finalizing App Dynamics. And we also have integrations with notification platforms. So one really popular one, for example, is PagerDuty and Slack. So if you want to get notifications in PagerDuty and Slack instead of an email, we have integrations with that as well. Because ultimately, like, everyone's stack is different, but you need to be able to work within their stack and unify in some capacity. So that's one of the advantages of using a platform versus a downloadable application. All right, cool.
Yeah, everyone, thanks so much. This has been a ball. You'll feel free to follow up. This is not necessarily the end of the conversation. If you guys have more questions, we're not going anywhere anytime soon. So for everyone that took time of the day, thanks so much for coming. For those of you who are watching the launch today, I will be there with you with bated breath, and more good stuff coming from us. Looking forward to seeing you all next time.
Great. Thanks, everyone.
Later, y'all.